Of all the common defenses of retro video games, more specifically third-generation arcade-like video games, stating the game is just Nintendo Hard is the common defense of a game's high difficulty, but the question is whether this is good game design or not. Hello everyone, Alec Elger the SideQuest Gamer here, and lately I've been playing a lot of NES games, whether they be for reviews or just for fun. Some I had a lot of fun with, while others left a lot to be desired. I've criticized games for being hard for the wrong reasons, as well as easy for the wrong reasons. First off, what is Nintendo Hard, and why is it called that? Well, it's no secret that many gaming veterans have observed that games released today are often not as hard as the games they grew up with, specifically 80s gamers. So when referring to Nintendo Hard, the NES was back then known as the Nintendo, not the Nintendo Entertainment System that we call it now, and wasn't really called by its abbreviation the NES until newer Nintendo consoles came out. Regardless, on this Nintendo console were some really challenging games. Some required level memorization, some required mastering of controls, some require precise reflexes, or even a little bit of everything I just mentioned. A big part of this Nintendo Hard factor is the limited continue system, where if you get a game over, that's it. You'd have to restart the game unless you have a continue at your disposal, so that the game itself wouldn't be hard, but there would be little room for error thanks to this limited continue system, if there are even any continues at all. A good example would be Super Mario Bros. I don't really find the game hard for the level design, but if you're not doing the infinite 1-up trick, it can be hard to make it to World 8 without getting a game over, unless you're just that good at the game with level memorization. It's not a good or bad design choice, but there is a reason why it no longer is common, which I'll get to later. There were also Nintendo games that were hard based on the ignorance of the player. For example, The Legend of Zelda is kind of frustrating if you don't know where a dungeon is. You could just spend hours going around the overworld trying to bomb every single nook and cranny until you actually find something. But once you do know where everything is, it's a lot easier, and the only challenge was getting past the later dungeons where the more powerful enemy types show up. It doesn't make this design choice any better, because it does cause tedium for the first playthrough. Metroid is another shining example of Nintendo Hard based on the ignorance of the player. The game only tells you you're going the wrong way if you're constantly dying by enemies more powerful than you, given your equipped abilities, of course. It's not impossible, but you're going to have a bad time unless you get the Varia suit and more powerful beam weapons. Nintendo Hard, it's a very broad definition as I just proved, where it can only be brought up with a generally hard game on the NES. You can play a game like Contra, die many times due to getting hit by one of the many projectiles on screen, lose all your lives, game over, restart the game, and say it's Nintendo Hard. Yet you're not doing that with Super Mario Bros., where the only challenge is not getting a game over. These are very punishing design choices, yet they make the game feel very rewarding, at least with Reflex Nintendo Hard akin to Contra and the several shmups on the console, because despite dying several times, it was because it was my fault and not the game's. The game gave me a sufficient amount of time to think and dodge quickly, so getting killed would be my own doing. But what about instances of Nintendo Hard that isn't good? When I think of a hard NES game that's only hard for the wrong reasons, Battletoads, the North American version, is usually my go-to example, and no, the Turbo Tonal is not the end-all verdict of my grievances with that game. I reviewed the Japanese version last year and said that some design choices of the platforming segments were poorly designed because not only were the controls awkward for those sections, but also because there could be instant kill spikes up ahead but you wouldn't realize until it's too late. That is not challenging, that is frustrating. Sure, if you memorize the level and play the game over and over and over to the point where it's not really a big deal, you can get by, but that's all you're really doing, getting by. I'm not saying the game should hold your hand, but it shouldn't make things near impossible on the first playthrough by throwing in obstacles you didn't see coming. And there is a reason why Nintendo Hard for the wrong reasons exists in a lot of NES games. North America houses one of the largest gaming markets out in the world, so when you hear the term Nintendo Hard, it's most likely from a North American. So when a great portion of the world's gaming population experiences these design choices for the longest time, it's therefore the norm of game design. So who fed these design choices, both good and bad, to them? The answer is the publishers themselves. I'm not saying that NES gamers' childhoods were mostly filled with lies, but in Japan, sometimes games that were moderately difficult are much harder over in North America because, unlike America, renting video games is illegal in Japan unless the publisher consents to renting out games, which none of them did because, well, they have to make money somehow. The rental market was said to be detrimental to developers and game sales because why would you want to buy the game when you can just rent it out for the weekend and then beat it? They made the games much harder in order for that game to not be beaten within a mere weekend. They wanted you to invest so much time into it so you can actually buy it full price instead of just losing money renting it out. Provided not all developers made games intentionally harder to combat the rental market, but quite a great portion of them did back then, like with Battletoads and how they made it much harder with more turbo tunnel obstacles and more limited continues. And sadly, this form of Nintendo Hard being difficulty by region is something that didn't really go away until after the 4th generation, at least not with a night and day difference. There was also the arcade design choices which contributes to Nintendo Hard, where some arcade games were designed to take as many quarters from you as they can, which sometimes carried over to console games. A lot of early NES games felt very similar to arcade games, where the goal was not to get to the end of the game, but rather survive and get the highest score. Balloon Fight and Clue Clue Land are examples of this, and in my opinion, well-designed arcade-like games, because despite how challenging they could get, it's never really the game's fault if the player dies. The controls give the player no disadvantage when faced against the enemies, and the enemies are always distant enough at the start where you do have time to get to safety and avoid damage and plan your strategy carefully. Nintendo Hard went away because save systems became the norm, throwing away the need for limited continues or infinite continues. It became standard to save your progress to pick up where you left off. And of course, the needlessly harder difficulty by region probably went away when the rental market became less threatening as games became a lot cheaper to buy and a lot longer to beat, lowering the incentive to rent a game and beat it within a mere weekend. Don't forget NES games were $50 back then, equaling $89 if you adjust for inflation as of 2016. But just because games were harder back then doesn't mean that there aren't any hard games now. The Dark Souls franchise is reputable for being very challenging, yet you can save at a bonfire. As technology evolved, so did gaming, and with that, developers took what worked and threw away what was obsolete. I am glad the best parts of Nintendo Hard can be seen in games like Dark Souls and most of the space shooters that come out on Steam, while more dated aspects have been left with the times. So if excusing questionable design choices in older games with just, "it's Nintendo Hard," you're going to have to elaborate a lot more as to why it's actually good game design, because Nintendo Hard is such a broad term to use and I wouldn't advise it unless you're going to follow it up with a paragraph of why this is good game design or not. Thank you all so much for watching, and remember to stay awesome.